Retreat from Gettysburg, Part 2, July 8. Southern infantry were still concentrated around Hagerstown. General Lee and his staff spent the day scouting to find a defendable line between Hagerstown and Williamsport. Northern infantry continued their movement toward Turner's Gap, and by the end of the day, all 7 Union infantry corps were on a line between Boonesboro on the west and Frederick on the east. Meade's troopers were suffering. Brown reports that half of the 11th Corps was said to be shoeless by the 8th. Wittenberg in his book wrote that the Army was badly in need of shoes and other supplies, and a pause was necessary to accommodate the distribution of these much-needed items, unquote. Union cavalry was in position at Boonesboro to screen the approach of the Army of the Potomac. Stuart's cavalry was moved forward toward Boonesboro to scout and to cover foraging parties scouring the area. Stuart wrote in his report, "The cavalry was thrown forward toward Boonesboro to threaten an advance upon the enemy, and thus cover the main body, and an animated fight ensued," unquote. So let's look at a close-up. See Hagerstown, Beaver Creek, Boonesboro, and South Mountain. Buford and Kilpatrick's divisions were at Boonesboro. Stuart's division moved from Hagerstown south toward Boonesboro, and this was a feint to protect Lee's infantry around Hagerstown. Buford's division responded first, and there was a back-and-forth battle centering on the Beaver Creek Bridge. Around midday, Kilpatrick heard the gunfire, and his division joined the fight. Ryan and Schoss wrote, "At 11:30 a.m., Kilpatrick fired off a status report to Pleasanton at Army headquarters in Frederick. The enemy had forced Merritt's brigade back toward Boonesboro, and Buford was about to withdraw to South Mountain. The mercurial Kilpatrick announced he would hold the town as long as possible and then retire fighting on Buford. Kilpatrick's report prompted Meade to order Howard to move his 11th Corps with urgency to the top of South Mountain to support the Union cavalry," unquote. At the end of the day, Buford and Kilpatrick started a slow retreat back toward Boonesboro. Stuart spotted the infantry reinforcements and retired back toward Funkstown. Eric Wittenberg in his book called this a win for Stuart, writing that they successfully carried out their mission of screening Lee's infantry, unquote. Buford's report said, "I've had a very rough day of it. Early this morning, the enemy advanced upon me in a pretty strong force, cavalry, infantry, and artillery. And during the first part of the day, they pressed me severely and came near the town. Toward night, I turned the tables upon them and drove them across the Antietam toward Hagerstown and Williamsport. You never saw the division behave better. My loss is not heavy. The artillery fire was very hot. All of my fighting had to be on foot," unquote. Ryan and Schoss wrote, "Stuart's take on the engagement was quite different. His role was not to defeat the enemy, but buy Lee's army time and slow down Meade's advance, something he did exceedingly well. He withdrew only when the enemy was reinforced and his ammunition running low," unquote. July 9. General Lee's engineers laid out their defense line probably about here, and work parties started digging fortifications. The Union infantry moved forward from Middletown and Frederick up into the gaps along South Mountain, behind the cavalry screen at Boonesboro. General Lee's Assistant Adjutant General, Colonel Walter Taylor, wrote that, "The reason Lee's army had so much time to prepare their defense was the attack by Stuart's cavalry, which checked the advance of the enemy," unquote, near Boonesboro the day before. Both Union and Confederate cavalry kept their positions on the 9th, but again there was skirmishing along Beaver Creek. Around mid-afternoon, Buford's division engaged and drove Stuart's cavalry back from the creek, and Buford in his report wrote, "Attacked the enemy at 4 p.m. and drove him handsomely about 2 miles," unquote. And Stuart wrote, My command kept the position in front of Funkstown assigned to it the night before." Unquote. July 10. Union infantry moved forward into positions along Antietam Creek and Beaver Creek. That evening, Confederate infantry moved into their fortifications along the Downsville line. Let's look at a close-up view of the Battle of Funkstown on July 10. Funkstown is here. Antietam Creek here, and Beaver Creek is here. Buford attacked at 8 a.m. south of Funkstown. At noon, Kilpatrick's division joined, and 6th Corps moved up in support east of Beaver Creek. Buford and Kilpatrick withdrew at 3 p.m. to their former positions, and then late that night, Stuart's division withdrew to the west side of Antietam Creek. And Stuart wrote, "Owing to the great ease with which the position at Funkstown could be flanked on the right, and by a secret movement at night the troops there cut off, it was deemed prudent to withdraw to the west side of the Antietam, which was accordingly done." Unquote. So who won? Stuart withdrew, but a question. Was Colonel Taylor correct? Was it Stuart's resistance that provided the time to complete the Downsville line? It was that evening on the 10th that Lee's army moved into their fortified line. Brown wrote in his book that, through it all, Stuart's cavalrymen and their infantry and artillery supports had purchased Lee's army a precious 12 hours that day. Unquote. Wittenberg called the Battle of Funkstown a Union victory, while Leno calls it a Southern victory. July 10 seemed to be a critical day. Ryan and Shaws commented on Meade's decision-making. If he had moved more aggressively on July 10, he could have intercepted Lee's men while they were moving into their new line of entrenchments. His inaction was an obvious misreading of, or lack of reaction to, intelligence indicating Lee's army had not yet taken up its new position. Lee won that round in the Battle of Wits by keeping his army in the vicinity of Hagerstown just long enough to entice Meade to concentrate his command there, rather than driving his corps straight ahead until his lead elements reached the Potomac River. Unquote. July 11. The realization set in that the situation for the Union was now changed. The chase was over, and Union troops were now facing an entrenched enemy. Wittenberg wrote, "Regardless of where the Army of the Potomac attacked, a formidable barrier awaited its divisions, and every general, and most of its privates, knew it." Unquote. Several writers compared the Downsville line to Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg. Wittenberg quoted General Slocum, commander of the Union 12th Corps, describing his position at the south end of the Union line. "I regard the position utterly untenable. There are 2 ranges of hills in my front, the first of which commands my position, and the second commands the first. Both ranges are occupied by the enemy, and I've been informed that the enemy have been constructing works on the second range." Unquote. Colonel Charles Wainwright was Chief of Artillery for the U.S. First Corps. His comment on the Downsville line was, "Lee's position in front of us is very strong, and so far as we can see, well mounted with artillery. My opinion is most decided, we could not carry it." Unquote. Ryan and Shaws write that on July 11, Lee only needed 1 or 2 more days for enough time to get the bridge repaired, and then he could slip away into the night. Pickett's division, with the Union prisoners, crossed over to Virginia on the ferries at Williamsport, and Buford's division moved south to Bakersville. Kilpatrick pushed north through Funkstown to the west side of Antietam Creek. July 12. At noon, Kilpatrick's division moved into Hagerstown, supported by an 11th Corps brigade. General Meade's engineers reported that the Potomac had fallen enough that the ford at Williamsport was now usable. General Meade called a council of war. He favored an attack on the Confederate lines the next day, July 13. A vote was held, and there was a deadlock. Meade postponed the attack and instead ordered a reconnaissance in force for 7 a.m. on the 14th. After 11 p.m., the Confederates successfully reconnected the pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. Brown summarized the situation on the crossing this way. The bridge at Falling Waters was ready, but given the size of the trains still in and along the river bottom land at Williamsport, the entire army could not cross it in time to avoid being attacked. Lee still needed the river to fall so that some of his troops could ford it at Williamsport. July 13. Buford was covering the left flank and Kilpatrick the right, and Stuart's cavalry moved to the Confederate left and prepared to cover the infantry while they withdrew. The pontoon bridge at Falling Waters was ready for use in the early morning on the 13th. Before noon, General Lee told Longstreet that the water level in the Potomac had dropped enough that the river was fordable and that the bridge was repaired. The wagon trains would cross immediately, but the troops would wait until after dark. Lee's general strategy, given that the Downsville line was long, 9 miles, and strong in the center, was to withdraw the 2 flanks first, leaving the center to cover the retreat. So, Ewell's corps on the north and Longstreet's corps on the south would leave first. Hill's corps would cross last. Ewell's corps would cross on the ford at Williamsport. Hill and Longstreet, on the center and south end of the line, would use the bridge at Falling Waters. Lee expected that the Union Army would launch a vigorous attack once it realized they were escaping across the bridge. His engineers had already identified a defense line that connected the bends above and below Falling Waters, and once the design was approved, the engineering crew and pioneers got to work fortifying the position. July 14. It seems that both Ewell's and Longstreet's corps left their positions about the same time, late on the night of the 13th, and Brown described the system used to sequence the withdrawal. As each division moved out, 1 regiment from each brigade was left holding the trenches. And then each regiment left a company behind, and when they were ready to go, Stuart's cavalry stepped into their places to take over. The cavalry would take the last place in line at the crossing. In piecing together all the information I can find, it seems the timing of the crossings was this. Ewell's corps forded the river at Williamsport. Rhodes' division about midnight, Johnson's division about 3 a.m., Early's division at 4 a.m., and then Stuart's cavalry division followed last about 7 a.m. Longstreet's corps crossed on the bridge at Falling Waters, followed by Hill's corps. Pickett's division is missing from this list because they ferried across with the Union prisoners on the 11th. So McLaw's division about 6 a.m., Law's division, which is formerly Hood's division, about 7 a.m., Anderson's division from Hill's corps at 8 a.m., Lane's division, formerly Pender's division, at 9:30 a.m., and Heath's division last at 10:30 a.m. General Meade's reconnaissance in force began as planned at 7 a.m., and writers have commented that starting just 2 hours earlier might have made a big difference. One more time, let's see a close-up of the action. Buford and Kilpatrick are on the Union flanks. The river ford at Williamsport is here, and the pontoon bridge at Falling Waters is here. At Williamsport, Ewell's corps was across by dawn. Stuart's cavalry division began crossing behind them, and once across, Stuart's division continued on to Leetown. It seems that congestion and muddy roads delayed the crossing at Falling Waters. Anderson's division was first across from Hill's corps. Lane's division waited at the crossing, and Heath's division, last in line, deployed in the fortifications defending the crossing. Time passed, and through some confusion, the cavalry screen protecting the crossing at Falling Waters was removed without the infantry commanders knowing. Buford and Kilpatrick's divisions both began moving at 7 a.m., and both found the positions in front of them were empty. Buford continued toward Falling Waters, Kilpatrick toward Williamsport, and Ryan and Schoss describe what happened then on Kilpatrick's front at Williamsport. The general ordered his troopers to ride directly to the river and leave behind any straggling rebels they came across. The cavalry dash reached an empty Williamsport. The Confederates selected to use that ford had already done so. With Kilpatrick's consent, Brigadier General George Custer drove his brigade south toward Falling Waters, and Kilpatrick followed with the rest of his division." Unquote. At Falling Waters, Buford attacked and began to slip around Heath's right and into his rear. The Union cavalry attack came as a surprise. The sound of gunfire filled the river gorge, and Brown quotes General Lee as saying, "There, I was expecting it, the beginning of the attack," unquote. And then Kilpatrick's division arrived, piecemeal, and crashed into the fight from the north. According to Wittenberg, Kilpatrick's attack was reckless. It disrupted Buford's plans and prevented a coordinated attack. The author of the foreword to Wittenberg's book wrote, "Union cavalry nearly checkmated Lee's crossing of the Potomac, capturing more than 1,500 Southern infantry and mortally wounding a division commander, Brigadier General J. Johnston Pettigrew." Unquote. By noon on July 14, the entire rearguard of Lee's army was across the bridge and on the south side of the river. The pontoon bridge was cut loose to prevent Union troops from following. How was it that Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia escaped? General James Wadsworth, division commander in the First Corps, was quoted saying it was because nobody stopped him. Unquote. So this story's over, but what happened afterwards to Jeb Stuart, John Buford, John M. Bowdoin, and Judson Kilpatrick? In October of 1863, John Buford was promoted to command the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Cumberland, but fell sick with typhoid before he could join his new command, and he died in December 1863. Jeb Stuart continued serving as a cavalry commander for General Lee. He was wounded, leading a counterattack on May 11, 1864, and died the next day. Judson Kilpatrick survived the war with controversy following every step. He was active in Republican Party politics after the war, became U.S. ambassador to Chile, and died there in Chile in 1881. John M. Bowdoin continued serving as a cavalry commander until incapacitated with typhoid in the fall of 1864. After the war, M. Bowdoin resumed his legal career and was active in politics and business, and he died in Damascus, Virginia in 1895.